Good morning, HackSpaceCon. Oh my God, that was painful. Good morning, HackSpaceCon. Good morning. Today's lesson, no. I'm no longer a professor, thank God for you. Should have been in my stats class. Oh yeah. You think you'll be bored now? You should have been in my class. So thanks for coming today. Thanks. We're going to have a great panel here. It's about space, it's cybersecurity, it's democratization in space, and a whole bunch of other topics that are pertinent to the space community today. The first thing I'd like to do is allow 31.2 seconds for each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll start right in with the questions. We'll start on the far end.
All right, good morning, everyone. Scott Savitsky. I'm the Launch and Test Range System CISO. So I'm stationed down here at Patrick Space Force Base, and I have the luxury of managing all the cyber for Patrick, Cape Canaveral, and Vandenberg. So any questions related to space, hit me up later.
Morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Gossel. I'm an interested participant here and don't know much about hacking at all. I spent 35 years, or almost 35 years, in the United States intelligence community. So I'm here to look at things I tend to look at things from an adversary's perspective. And I'm paranoid by trade, so that's me.
Hey there, Tyler Fordham, Director of Penetration Testing and Offensive Security at Dark Wolf Solutions. I lead a team that goes after, breaks into, and hacks into a lot of different systems, hardware-based, and we do a lot of work directly with the U.S. Space Force in terms of penetration testing and offensive security today. So happy to share some of those experiences with y'all, at a high level at least.
Good morning, Jacob Oakley. I've been doing offensive security, offensive cyber stuff for about 20 years, and maybe the past 6 or 7 supporting aerospace. I'm the technical director at a company called SIXGEN, and we do a lot of those things for a lot of the people you'd expect.
And I'm Greg Carpenter, the moderator for the panel discussion, former Chief of Special Space at National Security Agency. And we're going to kick it right off with the first question. I'm going to give a background, a little setup, and then we're going to have the questions. Space was once reserved for nation states with billion-dollar budgets. Now any student can launch CubeSats, billionaires can launch rockets, and startups can rent orbital real estate. The skies are crowded not just with opportunity, but with risks. So let me start off with Jeff and ask the question, what are the real security risks that come with the democratization of space?
Thanks, Greg. So I think the real answer is the one that everybody would expect, and that is there are so many risks you can't even describe them all. Democratization of space means a greater population. I know that, for example, that the Chinese are starting to launch proliferated constellations, and over the next few years they'll have those 2 constellations that they're talking about publicly will be on the order of 30,000 spacecraft in low Earth orbit. So just that move in and of itself is a great threat, just because of the population of orbits and the risk of collisions and the risk of, in particular, of if a collision occurs, the debris that remains. If you all recall the 2007 anti-satellite test that the Chinese conducted, I think it was January 2007, there were more than 3,000 pieces of debris in low Earth orbit, and those have continued to create issues since that date, almost 20 years ago. So things of that nature are very difficult. What happens also is the fact that with the lowering of launch costs, and I think we'll all thank Elon Musk for that, that has really driven the ability for basically anyone to put something on orbit, as Greg mentioned in the setup. What happens then also is that not everybody has good intentions with what they're putting on orbit. So, and even if they do have good intentions, mistakes can happen, and a kinetic impact is dangerous in and of itself. Not to mention all the cyber-related incidents that are going to be increasing in the near future.
I'll plus up on that. I think there's another interesting angle, and you touched on some of this, right? And that the democratization, not only has effects in terms of the kinetic and actual genuine cyber risks, but even thinking about the fact that before, we were in an era where there was no commercialization of space, governments launched all of this, and what you see is what you get, right? The US and China are going to protect their national interests, et cetera. But now, quite frankly, you have people who own these companies who are basically at the helm of being able to make potential national security decisions. We've seen the examples of Starlink's importance over in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and realizing that that's an element to the space domain and the warfare and the risks there that hasn't existed before, right? If I own some of these assets, whether the government is using them or not, I potentially have a role in being able to shape how a conflict plays out. And so that happening in Ukraine, Russia is one thing, but imagine, you know, a world where perhaps the Pacific conflict kicks off, and then you have US versus Asian vendors up in space that basically are having to fight proxy wars on behalf of the governments, and it just adds a layer of depth. And of course, all of those companies themselves are going to have cyber risks, and so the domino continues to fall a little further there.
Thank you. Let's go on to question 2. In terrestrial systems, a breach can trigger containment protocols, patches, and even a manual reset. In orbit, 36,000 kilometers above us, there's no physical access, no real-time interventions, and no margin for error. Space assets are isolated, delay-bound, and often built on legacy systems that were never designed to withstand modern cyber threats, like an old SCADA box. Each vulnerability becomes a permanent fixture, drifting, exposed, and potentially exploitable for years. Scott, what makes cybersecurity in space fundamentally more complex and fragile than it is here on Earth?
That's a great question, and I'll joke. I know there's some folks in this room that probably never heard of MS-DOS 3.1 because you're too damn young. But no kidding. On network, I have DOS 3.1 running 2 386s. So from a cybersecurity perspective, it's a difficult challenge. But to Craig's question, it's having models like on your ground station and be able to test and patch and figure out, you know, vulnerabilities that are going to occur in space is kind of key. Built within that is, I've seen a shift. I've been working in the space community for about 7 years where cyber was not even a word. It was laughable. As long as the lights were green, we're launching rockets and, you know, it's mission success. But now cyber's being developed as from blueprints all the way through launch, which is a great thing. But being able to manage vulnerabilities from the ground, from a spacecraft that's like 36,000 kilometers away is essential. But being able to have, I'll call it a operational copy here on Earth is essential, and being able to test and make sure before we push a patch that it's not going to knock that bird out of the sky.
Yeah, I actually think there's, to follow on to that, I think there's really two like abstract issues that play into what the complexities are for cybersecurity for space systems. One is on an architectural side, right? So you have a system where implicit trust between the ground and space to space and space to the ground is almost viewed as a requirement, and where defense in depth is extremely challenging to implement, right? And so that makes it a very difficult environment to implement cybersecurity. On the other side, you have the way risk calculus is viewed, right? So it's not so much how do I recover from this? It's there's a potential with space systems that if it's compromised, somebody else now owns and can operate that asset. And so when you're thinking about, you know, if this is worth $100 million to me and I'm going to invest 5% of my budget to protect it because that's how much value I put in this, you know, to the adversary, it's not just a $100 million satellite, it's a loss to you and something they gain. And so having to have that dynamic thought process when evaluating how to protect these things because of how they're viewed as a target by somebody else is also very important.
Satellites today are no longer simple relays. They're critical infrastructure. They connect economies, militaries, entire populations, but like SCADA systems, they're never designed with security in mind. So let me reiterate and go back over this again. We talked about how vulnerable the systems are to cyber or physical attacks. Have we already seen active attempts at space-based cyber intrusions? I'll open that up for anybody right now. Sure.
I mean, I'll make a general comment. There's few and far between public examples of space systems being compromised. Back into the 90s and early 2000s, you have like NASA and ESA satellites being compromised via the ground station. I guess one event I'd like to point out that I think maybe look back on in this whole context as being pretty important is you had an Indian satellite that had a piece of what seemed to be related code to Stuxnet affect the microcontrollers that controlled parts of that satellite. And why that's important is every other example, and there's not many, of space systems being compromised involves, using the intended tasking mechanisms for the satellite to just tell it to do something bad, like, hey, point at the sun and burn out your optics, right? But that Indian compromised actually has code not built by the engineers of the space system that was introduced to the space system that caused a failure, right? And so while there's not a lot, that is a unique example of how these things may happen in the future.
Yeah, and I'll plus up on that and say that I think we can't abstract too many layers away from the cyber issue, right? Because it's easy to look at the satellites themselves and think this is where I need to find the cyber vulnerabilities, but quite frankly, we have a long and storied history, particularly those who come from the intel community, of understanding that anything that's associated with any of our warfare domains is constantly being targeted by our adversaries, right? That includes government facilities, US contractors, what have you. So we have the space systems, we have the Space Force and an entire community surrounding that. And it isn't just the satellites or the things up in orbit themselves, but you have to recognize that every time that there's an intrusion into any company that directly works alongside all of this, or any organization that works alongside of all of this, you don't need to necessarily get into the satellite to affect space operations. If you get into one part of a local area network that, let's say, processes telemetry data, or handles commands somewhere down the line, or hell, handles the IT help requests for people working on space projects, you are still affecting that domain, and all of that is, that targeting is happening nonstop everywhere. It's just a little harder to see.
So the scariest thing here is that I just realized that all of our pictures are being broadcast on that big screen down there, so I'm really nervous about that. But one comment to make, and I appreciate everything that these guys have said, but one comment to make is that even if there has been real command intrusion on military or governmental satellites in the past, we're not likely to know about it for a couple of reasons. One is the government's never going to release the information. Number two is that I'm concerned that young active duty space operators are going to not understand what's happening, even if their monitors are showing errant behavior by the satellite that they're working with. They might not, their minds are not going to go first to, oh, somebody's trying to intrude on the command system of the satellite. They're going to go to another, there's a thruster malfunction or something along those lines. So those two things bother me greatly, and so to the answer to the question directly, I don't think we know, Greg.
Cool. Great. So, and to look at another aspect of that, I think physiologically, we should look at hacking also, because that's the social engineering aspect, and physiological manipulation is something that we actually seem to forget about sometimes when we're talking about hacking. But to that point, the human brain has not evolved in space. It's evolved here on ground. Our immune system, our hormones, our perception of time, everything's related to, it's tied to our terrestrial existence. So as we prepare for these long duration missions, we have to confront some of the questions that are really important in that aspect, and that would be what happens when the mind becomes a vulnerability, or you can exploit that vulnerability. So let me ask Tyler, what are the security risks when psychological or biological limits are reached in long-term missions?
So, I don't even think you necessarily have to tie the answer to this question specifically to space travel, right? If you look at basic PSYOP and social engineering principles, the core thing is that someone who is under any amount of stress or duress or anxiety is going to be a bigger mark, right? And so let's abstract away from actually being up in space. If you're working in this field, if you are part of these intense operations at all, if you're in the training pipeline, those are all elements themselves that make you more likely to click on a phishing link, more likely to make a mistake and over-reveal or over-indulge information. It makes you an easier target for foreign intelligence services who are really good at doing this kind of stuff. And I think that, as we examine this problem set and think about, to your point, folks actually being up in space, and we imagine a future 5, 10, what have you, years from now, where we're social engineering people who are in orbit. We're not that far off from it. I mean, Katy Perry just got back, of course, but And we've seen what kind of foolish choices that everybody derides people for while being up there for only a limited period of time. I think that there's just a lot in terms of basic human and social engineering that applies to this problem space that we're going to encounter a whole lot of learning in, as human space travel starts to become a little more accessible.
One of the things that we found in some of the research in this area is basically that because humans function differently in different gravity fields and in different electromagnetic fields, that it actually affects the physiology and the functionality of their bodies. And so a social engineering maneuver that would happen here would have to be done a little differently in space for a little different duration in a little different way. So this is an emerging field that really isn't much looked into yet, but I think that anybody interested in that could find that there is a plethora of data that's coming forth on how you can affect, social engineering-wise, affect people in different ways. So, anybody else have anything on that?
No,
Yeah,
I just think with an echo on that, I mean, we're in a generation of AI. So, I mean, with social engineering and, it's back to Jeff's comment about space operators and trying to determine the difference between what's real and what's fake. AI is becoming really real in your face when 90% of the time it's fake. So, I mean, that's a battle for us, even on the cyber side, to kind of protect, the social engineering perspective on the AI perspective of what's real and what's not.
Single misconfigured satellite could disable global GPS, paralyze financial markets, scramble emergency systems, or even worse. Most people won't even know what hit them. Our digital lives rest on the silent systems in a synchronized, delicate dance above the Earth. Let me come back to Tyler for this first. Two-part question. First, is space collectively a critical infrastructure? And if yes, then how do we secure space in that manner?
I think I'll immediately go back to the example that we talked about earlier, right, where you had an active war zone directly impacted by space-related decisions of a satellite deciding to beam down or not. It is clearly that level of physical infrastructure, particularly, let's say, in a world where we have recently seen conflicts where there's tons of jamming, EW removes the ability to communicate on the battlefield, and you can't count on, basic connections and wired things. I mean, those of you who come from any kind of military planning intelligence background might imagine that the first thing, let's say a full-scale conflict kicks off, that's going to go is a lot of the ground-based infrastructure that provides a lot of that connection. So in a world where maybe all your wires are getting bombed and your undersea cables getting cut, if the only thing that you can rely on there is that satellite infrastructure, it's not only the infrastructure, but it's the most critical one. And I think it's matter of fact that that's the case. And the interesting thing is that the geopolitical aspects of a lot of this, you think about the space treaty, I forget the other adjective here, but from the 60s, right? The broad agreements that every country made that meaningful assets up in space should not be targeted, that we should be nice. As we've talked about ASATs earlier, anti-satellite weapons, we're clearly in an era where that kind of infrastructure is going to be subject to basically the whims of the superpowers that don't really have to abide by those accords. And so it's a tricky spot to be in where how do you defend the infrastructure that's up there with very little to do in the way of stopping anything, right?
Yeah, I guess another thing I would point out is that all the other critical infrastructures that are outlined by CISA, how many of those fall apart if they don't have access to the accurate time that they receive from the GPS constellation, right? So without time, you don't have, communications protocols or navigation or all these other things. And if you look at the critical infrastructures that are already listed there, almost 201, I think they rely on time to function correctly. So I think it would have to be considered that.
I always describe space as the ubiquitous enabler. And it is, from a military perspective, The space is enabling of the other operations from the other services. It is likewise an enabler for all of us in our everyday lives. Heck, I used it just to get here this morning because I didn't know exactly where this building was, so my phone was telling me where to go. And so that's critical. Is it critical infrastructure by governmental definition? Well, it could be. I think there was a bill submitted to the Congress in February of this year. It's not the first time it's happened, but this has happened recently. And it would, if declared a space as if space is declared as a critical infrastructure, then it would direct the director or the Secretary of Homeland Security to protect all the assets related to space operations. That includes satellites on orbit, ground stations, production facilities, et cetera, et cetera. What strikes me as a little bit strange, if you will, and this is just Jeff's opinion, but I think that if you read through the newspapers and look at space news and you look at Breaking Defense and all the different sites that talk about space on a daily basis, or more frequently than that, the threats are increasing tremendously across the board. And these are intentional threats and non-intentional threats. Space Force who is designated to protect the spacecraft on orbit. So if you throw the Department of Homeland Security in there as well, I'm interested to see where the play off of each other will happen, because that's what the Secretary of Homeland Security will be tasked to do by the United States government. So it's an interesting thing for me at least to ponder.
So in that case, let me throw a question out to anybody here. How would you conduct incident response in space?
I'll give you, so current project for us right now for launch and test range is, it's a nickname called Spaceport of the Future. And within that context, it's not, so out here at Slick 39, Slick 40, we've launched, I think, 41 rockets so far this year. The intent of Spaceport of the Future is to have the ability to move a rocket from a facility, put payload on that rocket, and launch not one, two, but several rockets a day to space to deal with incident response, to deal with a GPS satellite knocked out of orbit, so on and so forth. So I mean, that is, that's big picture. Incident response, I think unfortunately, I had a former commander, his quote was, "Nothing's gonna change until a satellite falls out of the sky or China and Russia owns one of our satellites."
Or
that's the unfortunate, or someone dies. That's the unfortunate circumstance we're in. So I mean, to deal with an incident, it's huge.
And I'll throw out there, again, I'm going to keep harping on this. Having led incident response tasks for the Space Force and actually with Scott's team in a prior time here, again, it's not just the systems up in space, right? And so while breaking into proprietary, scary satellite hardware probably sounds a little spooky even for those of you who have a little bit of an incident response background, recognize that there are other domino layers to this, right? And some of the traditional things in terms of detailing event logs, reading memory on systems, the same things that you would do in traditional Linux and Windows networks are very relevant parts of this process, because if someone got up into a satellite, there's a very good shot that all of the connecting infrastructure that's on the ground is probably related there too. And so, there are elements to this that are not just trying to figure out the tricky space components themselves.
However, if we do need to figure out those tricky space components, which I think Greg mentioned, there's going to be a lot of things that historically have not occurred that have to occur now, and one of them is Delta V. When you have extremely limited Delta V that's only intended to let a satellite station keep for a 5-year lifespan, you're not going to be able to move out of the way of much. You're not going to be able to change planes. You're definitely not going to be able to change orbits. That kind of thinking has to change. And the government will have to start, in particular Space Force, will need to start thinking about things like, how do you repair a satellite on orbit? How do you do it autonomously? How do you do it definitely remotely? Where do you get the parts? Are there supply stores, Amazon, the distribution center on orbit somewhere, where you can, go online? I could just see General Saltzman ordering up a part for GPS satellite, and that's kind of funny. I'm going to talk to him about that. But anyway, you see what I mean. A lot of our thinking processes behind everything to do with space has to change into the future.
Okay.
I guess I would also just make the point, if you think about the reasons why some adversary would actually try to achieve code execution on orbital attack surface, it's probably for a reason that's to do something like disable or take over the satellite. And so your forensics response may by force be limited to all that stuff on the ground to try to figure out what went wrong, right? Because a lot of the typical reasons why somebody might compromise a network, then where forensics are going to help you kick them out, for instance, are motivations that could probably be levied against that system on the ground.
So dynamic mitigation is something we should consider in the future, as well as if something's connected to something, then something else is connected to that something, which is connected to something else, which means that that's connected to something else. And there's not just one way into a satellite. SpaceX now launches more rockets than most governments. As of today, Starlink provides more global internet coverage than any telecom. The space race is no longer between superpowers. It's mostly between stakeholders. So to Tyler, I'll ask the question, should companies be required to meet national defense grade cybersecurity standards for space launches?
Cybersecurity standards, absolutely. I mean, if we are going to apply a level of rigor to the systems that we build, you know, in governmental spaces, which obviously have a little bit less agility than certain commercial vendors, you know, have the luxury of having, you know, they should be subject to those same standards for all the same reasons. You know, if you think about, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, one of the biggest targets when you can't break directly into a government system is to go after the people who are contracting and working for them. There's a long and storied history of the Chinas and the Russias breaking into US contractors to get to what they need. Heck, there are blueprints for planes that they've gotten a hold of because of that exact problem set. So, you know, not just the assets that they're building themselves, but the actual company's cybersecurity hygiene, their supply chain, and everything else is a big factor there. And you know, how do you achieve that? Now, some of you maybe come from like the cyber compliance world without subjecting them to years and years of paperwork like the risk management framework and certain implementations, you know, that break down that agility and, you know, kind of make you lose the purpose. And so figuring out ways where you can hold those kind of folks up to, let's say, like relevant, technical, meaningful cyber standards rather than only paperwork exercises is, I think, the way that we get ahead of this problem set without slowing things down too much.
I think to add on to that, and I'm a former Army person, I'm very simple. For me, if you're a commercial space launch community or whatever, you should have the ability to cyber protect your systems. I mean, you're launching rockets into space. If you can't come to me with a cyber secure system, I'm probably not going to let you launch a rocket. I mean, it's pretty simple.
I think that one challenge that comes along with that, though, is that it really is like international waters, right? And so if we make it too stringent to launch and operate out of the U.S., they're just going to do it somewhere else, right? And while an FAA for space would probably be the way to get these standards implemented, the issue is like the FAA has a carrot and a stick to get people to participate because you can't land your planes here if you don't follow our rules. But in space, they don't have to do that. There's no benefit largely for them operating out of the U.S. And so it's going to be hard to kind of get people to come to the table and play by those rules, even though it's absolutely necessary.
Build in incentives to make them pen test their stuff.
The incentive might be that they need to be convinced that the bad guys are not just going to target military satellites when they come after us. They're going to target commercial spacecraft as well. So in whatever way, you know, kinetically or non-kinetically. So convince them of that, and they may want to adopt some standards.
So in that light, so how do you design governance, rights, and cybersecurity protections for our extended off-world existence, not just satellites, but when we move and we create new communities in different places? Scott?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
Oh yeah. I mean, just within that, I mean, it's you got to start. I mean, with a baseline standard for kind of what's right, what's wrong. You know, unfortunately, I've been doing the boring RMF for a long time, though it's compliance and it's boring, but it's also a standard baseline that, you know, communities should follow. CMMC from the federal government side has been frozen for several years, where though it's not a real stringent standard, but is a standard for even these small commercial companies to follow. So I mean, there's, you know, standards like that. And I mean, it's back active now. So I mean, just having a standard baseline for communities to follow, I think is a good place to start.
You know, what's also tricky is like some of those baselines, you know, we run into this in just the hardware or odd proprietary systems space that's not even, you know, aerospace or space-based, but, you know, a lot of the standards that we have for governmental cyber regulations were built to help you secure your standard Windows network, right? And they can be poorly suited for systems that have completely different cyber considerations, like a frickin' satellite. And so trying to figure out ways to mesh those things together, or to only apply the portions, you know, of those frameworks that make sense while not getting bogged down by the parts that aren't applicable at all, you know, is part of the RMF struggle for sure.
Great. I want to thank the panel for their questions and their answers today. We're going to open it up to the floor for questions. I can barely see people, but if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone around to you. Yeah, unfortunately I can't see anybody. Yeah, right here in the middle. Can we get him a microphone? Was he in the Army? Thanks, Tyler.
So for low Earth orbit satellites, I understand that most of that is booked by nations pretty much on their own. So China can sell the same orbital path as the US, as France, as the US. Are there ways to kind of negate that potential overbooking of orbital paths?
I mean, at the end of the day, it's still, like I said, it's international waters, right? If you have a satellite and you have no active propulsion and you're worried about running into somebody else's satellite and they do, and you ask them to move and they don't see it as a big of a risk to waste their propulsion to move, like there's no legal culpability to go after them. It's not an act of war or anything like that, right? So I think the short answer is no. There's not really a good construct to mitigate those risks, but they certainly exist.
Cool. Thank you. Yes, right here in the middle. Oh.
They got him.
Has anyone started developing cyber resilience systems for space where you have multiple microservices that have heterogeneous code bases to allow us to detect and respond and recover while we're having slightly less mission functionality while we're trying to respond and react to the outage?
So you said the word microservices. I have to point out, you know, some of the things that are worth looking into. You know, a lot of the DoD software factories, particularly if you look into Space Camp and Platform One, they for a number of years have been starting to build a lot of, let's say, containerized solutions for both standard DoD hardware, but that's extending into space as well. And so there are definitely war stories of those organizations who are kind of like DevOps software focused, who are starting to put Kubernetes on satellites, even if it's notionally, right? Being able to shove a container and orchestrate it and move around pods on space hardware is probably a pretty good start to addressing the problem sets that you're you know, referring to. Now, having enough compute to do more with it is a whole nother problem satellite-wise, but would definitely recommend looking into the work of those organizations because they've gotten started on that problem set.
I would say broadly, the industry, aerospace industry, still has a lot of owner-operators who are very empowered to say no to things like that, even if they are the right solution. There's still a heavy focus on like, well, these resources are for me to do my ops or my mission, right? And I understand your cyber exists, but it takes away from that. So I think we're still in the nascent stages of getting buy-in from that community.
By the way, Space Camp being a different organization than Space Camp. Make sure you Google right.
Got it. We have a question right over here, please.
Hi. So earlier in the panel, you were talking about how we would be sending rockets up along with another rocket to do incident response for that main rocket. I was curious because if we send up more rockets with said rocket, wouldn't we then have to do physical and cyber response for that rocket as well?
Yes, yes, no, yes, no. No, 100% seriousness. So the intent would be it would be a 1-for-1. So if the payload got knocked out of orbit, the payload on the rocket going up would to be replace that active satellite in space. So it wouldn't necessarily be the rocket, it'd be more so the payload.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. We had another hand up here before. Yeah, right here.
Over here.
I got one right
Over here.
Yeah, I have one here.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
You were talking about space's designation potentially as critical infrastructure earlier. I know that for many of these systems, it's not just related to space, but you're going to be looking at a lot of industrial control systems. You're going to be looking at, SCADA systems for various things, stuff like that. I wanted to ask, do you think that critical infrastructure specific to space should have more stringent recommendations for security? OT has pretty stringent security recommendations already, but that's not necessarily followed in all cases. For something like NASA, when you have fuel being provided, something like that, do you think that there should be much more stringent recommendations for the security of those specific pieces of critical infrastructure?
So I think if officially designated as critical infrastructure, space as a critical infrastructure by Congress, then there will be equal amounts. I guess it's equally important to secure supply chains and ground stations and all those things not on orbit as well, including SCADA and all those considerations you mentioned. It's equally important as protecting the assets on orbit. They might be a little bit different in how you approach it in the protection sense, but all of it is important, and so you're absolutely right, and it needs to be, and I think that's the purpose of declaring it as critical infrastructure as compared to just asking the Space Force to protect its space assets.
I think another thing too is, you mentioned how strict OT security can be, right? That's because a robotic arm on a factory floor can kill somebody if it's been taken over. I think largely in space, it's going to be like a one hop of like, well, if you don't have time, then this fails, and then, the ambulance is late and somebody dies. So that's a little bit harder. But with the increase of like space tourism and things like that, I think you really have a place to, highly enforce higher security standards when you have human lives in the balance.
And we have a great example of exactly what you've mentioned, because the federal government told vendors to start putting up around their ICS SCADA systems after the Colonial Pipeline attack. And so that level of expectation has historically been successful at being asked for.
So you're not comfortable with 1980s SCADA technology in space? I'll make sure I understand that.
I own it.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry to hear. So, but this brings up an important point. When we talk about space tourism, how do we vet people who are going to be space tourists? There's a person, and I'll give an example. There's a person that I know, many of you might know him. His name is Len No, and he actually is a human cyborg. Basically, he has 13 implantable devices that he can, like, literally pull data right off your phone, locked phone. Do we vet people like this with silicon devices embedded in them that want to go to space, that want to enjoy the tourism aspect of space? Do we forbid them from going to space? Or do we wrap them in a Faraday suit?
I mean, that's why all the spacesuits of the 70s, looked like tinfoil, right?
They were fashionable. They were fashionable. Yeah, so. All right, there was a question over here. Right here, yes.
Yes, hi. So it was two-pronged question. With the introduction of cloud-based ground stations, for example, I've done assessments for a rover that went to Mars where there was a big cloud component, and they weren't, can't talk about it too much, but what the threat landscape, how does it increase when you introduce cloud elements that are susceptible to ground station operators and flight ops? When command and control can potentially compromise, it's not encrypted, it's not using RF or laser potentially. And also, secondly, do you think a framework like Sparta that aerospace is trying for space-based TTPs is a good idea for international unregulated space security, which is kind of where we are?
I mean, this is a pretty nuanced one, and I'll kick off with, there's good and bad when you involve cloud in any kind of like weapon system, right? We deal with this a lot, testing things that have been lifted and shifted from on-prem to cloud solutions, and ultimately, I don't think the risk is any more or less in general. It just changes. It changes how you secure it, it changes how you assess it, and it sure as hell changes how you attack it. And, you know, we've dealt with a lot of those same things, and I mean, I think what is tricky and what I like to make sure that people don't do is point at something in the cloud being vulnerable and use that as a reason to not modernize those assets, because there are a lot of arguments for, and oftentimes I think that that can be misleading. I think there are some other thoughts on the panel too. We can go back and forth on this.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, right, the ground station is a service that are being offered by several cloud platforms. I mean, they're providing you essentially a bent pipe to an antenna that you then get to do scheduling on. And while there are cloud vulnerabilities, I would argue that using that bent pipe is no more or less vulnerable than some ISP you're probably also going to use to get there. It makes it a more dynamic attack surface, and there's different ways to attack it, like Tyler said, but I don't, like from a risk perspective, I don't see that as heightening the risk of operating these systems, and it does increase the democratization of, you know, being able to use somebody else's ground entry point, right? You get more persistence of space and all those other things. I guess you also asked, that second part of your question was about like the Sparta framework and the viability of things like that. I mean, I think it's important work. There's so little public disclosure about the things that happen to space systems, and so for an organization with the heritage they have to at least put out their opinion on subject matter expertise for what could go wrong, and so people can map to it, right? Like that's a resource for commercial organizations to at least map to and have to stand on from a foundational perspective of cybersecurity, where they really wouldn't have, you know, access to other kind of threat data otherwise, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, to his point, right, like MITRE ATT&CK didn't start out perfect, but over the years and over time, examples of what attacks look like and how to defend against them and how to categorize them have turned that into something that can be used, you know, to actually be valuable. And so, you know, it takes time for these things to actually, you know, turn into something of use, I would suppose. So I'm waiting to give it more time.
Okay, we have time for like 2 more questions. Right over here, this guy over here, I want to get, but you go ahead first, and then we'll get you over on the far side, okay?
Yeah, I'm just enjoying this microphone. I've been on for a while. It's quite nice. But I do have one question, since we're talking about how satellites are pretty much like international waters, and that there's not really much regulation to that. Isn't there kind of a push for it? After all, while companies can use their satellites to do whatever they want in the sky, isn't there also like a lack of regulation to stop other people from doing things to said satellites? We may have the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act for people in the United States, but anywhere else, what would you charge anyone who tries to hack into a satellite or uses another satellite to break into another satellite?
I mean, the problem is, if you don't care about going back to the United States, then you don't have to care about breaking those laws, right? Like, yeah, there's a lot of countries that want everybody to play nice in space and are willing to sign a piece of paper about it. But if one of those countries feels like they need to go to war with another one of those countries, that piece of paper is not going to stop them from that behavior, right? And the threat of being prosecuted by international courts hasn't stopped any number of atrocities that have happened in other domains, right? So the want is there. I think the enforceability and implementation of something like that is extremely difficult.
And attribution.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and he said attribution, right? Like, attribution for cyber can be nearly impossible, and when you throw aerospace on top of that, it becomes even more challenging.
And even when you do have no kidding, matter-of-fact attribution, it can simply be denied, which is what we see in the cyber world all the time.
Absolutely. Okay. Got this one other question over here on the side.
So when I first started in cybersecurity and programming, I learned from school, and then someone gave me clean code, and then I started working on a CI/CD system, and then I got introduced to NIST 853, I didn't necessarily take a linear path to get here. What does the next generation of teaching people to code with space in mind look like in order to build secure by default systems moving forward?
I mean, that is a great question. I think one valuable point you could take away is that organizations like NASA and other companies, they open source a lot of their ground and flight software that they have out there, and those are used by hundreds, if not thousands of satellites. And so you can go to Git repositories and start playing with these frameworks that are used on space vehicles and for tasking on the ground. And even if, that doesn't cover every international satellite that's up there, like, they're all going to function architecturally in a similar manner, right? And so you can kind of figure, like, what are the things you're going to have to build and how.
I mean, I'll throw out, you're at the right place to start. And also a lot of this comes from community groundswell efforts, right? Hackasat has been very important. There's been a lot of training at places like DEF CON that are specifically related to this. Shout out to the Aerospace Village guys who are on next, who will have elements of that at their space. Yeah, I mean, and, at the same time as we called back to Hackasat and the Gov's role in that, there's going to be a lot that the government would get a lot of benefit out of investing in, to put more training out there and to create pipelines, to create the folks familiar with that technology set, just like you're talking about.
Only thing I could say is fail 7 times and then get yourself a big win.
Thanks for that.
Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for our panel. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for all your information and your input today. Everybody, again, welcome to HackSpaceCon. Have yourself a great time, and we'll see you out there on the floor.